Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. Welcome to the start of another semester of Sunday school. You are in the right place if you are here for church history. If you meant to be somewhere else, the doors are locking. You cannot leave now. Great to see you. If you're, a quarter of as excited to listen and learn as I am to get to teach these things. This class, as you heard Blair explain last week, there's different methods to these classes, so I apologize. This is more listening to Pastor Kevin. There will be maybe some time for questions, but as you can see with the arrangement, this is not going to be a small group discussion time, so that's just what you're in for, but hopefully it will feel different than a sermon. It will be stories. It will be history, obviously. How many of you were in for much of or most of the last class? I recognize a number of you, so great to have you back. If you weren't here, you don't need to know any of that, but you should know that. So this handout, I'm not big on handouts. We may have some things, some classes. I'm definitely not big on PowerPoint. There's no technology. I like old-fashioned whiteboard. If I could have a nice, cranky, dusty chalkboard, I would probably get that. But you can see where we were the last semester, and you can go, and if you want to listen to any of these, where's the best place, Albert? Clearlyreformed.org? Clearlyreformed.org is a clearinghouse for Kevin DeYoung content. So you can find all of those 10 there, and they're about an hour each, and then you can see, Lord willing, where we're going over these next 10 weeks. I will be here, I expect, for all of these 10 weeks, except for the last one, so we'll figure out what to do there, and probably have Matthew Kirk, who's the intern assigned to this class, so he's not here this morning, help out with that great ending to the course. So you can see where we're going. You probably recognize some names. Like today, you've heard of Patrick, maybe Thomas Aquinas at the end, John Wycliffe, and then there are probably some other names that you don't know much about or anything about. And my aim in this class, as I said at the opening of last year's class, is to try to help you learn church history and to do it by telling these true stories of these individuals in the history of the church. Now, there's deficiencies to this approach to church history. There's lots of things that are left out. There's lots of names you don't hear about, lots of dates, lots of important events and people and places. But I hope by zeroing in on these persons, not only will you get a little mini biography, but it will also give you a sense for the broader issues. So for next week, for example, looking at Benedict and the ordering of monasticism is going to be not just about Benedict, but what did he set in motion and why was he important? And this week we'll see that with Patrick and his significance. So zeroing in on these biographies, yes, there are things that are inspirational, but also the aim is simply to help you learn and to put some of the pieces together. It's really impossible to tell 2,000 years of church history in several semesters of courses, let alone in 10 weeks here and there over the course of several years. But my aim is to do this for the next 2 subsequent years, so you can get part 3 and part 4. Part 3 will be Reformation and beyond, and then part 4, Lord willing, will be the last couple of centuries. So you can see that this part 2, 451, that's the Council of Chalcedon, where we ended last year with Cyril and the debate over the 2 natures of Christ in the Council of Chalcedon, to 1415, which is the execution of Jan Hus, just to the cusp of the Reformation. So these years, which are called rather imperfectly the Middle Ages, though here we're really still at the end of late antiquity and the Roman Empire, medieval, unfairly called the Dark Ages. Of course, nobody living through these times said, you know where we are? We're in the Dark Ages. And nobody thought, you know what? We're in the middle of something because they're just living their life. It's later in looking back and some historians thinking, well, this time of Greco-Roman civilization was a real high point, and then there's kind of a contraction, and it's not until the explosion of the Reformation and the beginning of the early modern world, all of these other things are the middle. And they're really not dark ages, as we'll see, but it is true that Christianity, though it is expanding in many ways, in many places, and that will be one of the themes of St. Patrick's life, yet in the centuries to come, in particular, as Islam in the 7th century begins spreading out, this Christian civilization, which has been all around the Roman Empire in the East and in the West and around the Mediterranean and stretching far, is going to contract and be largely confined to Northern and Western Europe, which wasn't the design, but had everything to do with the spread of Islam. And we'll come to that in the weeks ahead. This morning, we come to this person who may be, of all of the names in church history, the one that is at the same time the most well-known and the most misunderstood. You've all heard of Patrick. How many, raise your hands with pride, how many of you are Irish? Not as many as I thought. How many of you wish you were Irish? Okay. I'm Dutch, and if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, so we get that. But I'm told that Kevin is an Irish Gaelic name that means gentle, handsome, kind. Wow, they nailed it. You will have reason to be somewhat proud of your Irish heritage with St. Patrick. You will also have reason to be sort of embarrassed when you learn a little bit more about the Irish that Patrick encountered. Almost everyone in this country, and wherever there is a celebration of St. Patrick, all throughout the Western world, has heard of this man, and yet what most people know about him, think they know about him, is wrong. For starters, Patrick was not Irish. Yes, he had everything to do with Ireland, we'll come to that, but he was not Irish, he was British. And when I say British, I don't mean English, because the Angles and the Saxons had not yet invaded the island of Great Britain. So we'll call them British. And the Irish very much don't want to say that Patrick was English. He wasn't English, but he wasn't Irish. He was this island to the east of Ireland called Britain. He did not drive the snakes out of Ireland. It had been well established for centuries that there were no snakes in Ireland, just the opposite of North Carolina, which is just teeming, infested. He did not write, I'm sorry to say, that wonderful poem, St. Patrick's Breastplate. Christ around me, Christ within me, Christ. That's how it ends. It's a beautiful poem. He didn't write it. Sorry to say, he did not teach the Trinity using the 3 leaves of the shamrock. And, most importantly, he would not be pleased to know that the holiday in his honor is celebrated largely by wearing green and getting drunk. It's not what his life was about. Everyone knows March 17, that's the day that history tells us he died, though we can't be sure, is St. Patrick's Day. They've heard of Patrick. You've heard of him. But we don't know, most of us, many actual facts about him. And there are many legends, but there are many things we can know about him. And it's a shame that we don't know more about Patrick, because I am certain that you are going to leave this class saying, why did I never know that about? And you are going to be eager to celebrate March 17, St. Patrick's Day. Though my Protestant friends in Northern Ireland always tell me, you wear orange on St. Patrick's Day. You don't wear green. Leave that up to you. He lived a remarkable life. It is not an exaggeration to say he changed Ireland, and you could make the case that in some ways he changed the history of the church and therefore even the history of the world. Like so many heroes from the ancient church, there are many legends surrounding Patrick. It can be hard to separate fact from fiction. I'm going to try to stick with what we know for sure. Many of the later stories come much, much later. 400 years later or centuries and millennia later. It's not until the 17th century that we first have a record that Patrick taught the Trinity using the leaves of the shamrock. Well, when that doesn't come to the 17th century and Patrick is here in the 400s, you think, maybe that wasn't true. Other legends appear sooner, but still 400 years later. And so if you read something, here's where we need some perspective, because we're here in 2023. If you read something and you said, oh, this record of Patrick's life comes from, say, the 800s, you're thinking, wow, that's really ancient. That's really old. That must be pretty close to the time of Patrick, because it all just sort of blends together. You got 400s, 800s. It's all a really, really long time ago. But 400 years is like if 150 years from now in 2176, someone first wrote a book saying George Washington had magic powers. I'm not sure. That's 400 years later. And even given the distance and the absence of manuscripts, we ought to be somewhat skeptical of these later legends. Thankfully, we have two texts which all but the most hypercritical scholars agree came from Patrick himself. If you wanted to read them, you could probably read them both this afternoon. They might take an hour and a half, 2 hours to read two of them. You can go on Amazon and you can find any number of copies. Here's a little copy of the one that I got, and it's not even this thick because this includes a whole bunch of other things. There's a homily from the Pope, and there's some other things in here. Two documents have survived from Patrick himself, and amazingly, these are the two earliest documents to have been written in Ireland that we know of. One is called the Confession, the Confessio in Latin. He wrote in Latin. And the other is a letter to the soldiers of this man named, Caradocus, who we'll come to at the very end. The Confession or the Confessio probably take you an hour. This might take you a half hour. These are not long documents. Both of them are written toward the end of his life. This one was written first. This one was written later. He wrote the Confession in order to give a defense of his ministry. He was nearing the end of his life, and he faced opposition, in particular from many of the bishops in Britain, various accusations which we'll come to. And so he wrote this confession to explain who he was, what he had done, and give a defense of his ministry. And thankfully, in this Confessio, he gives just enough biographical information so that we can sketch an outline of Patrick's life. Patrick was born a Roman citizen in Britain near the end of the 4th century. We don't know for sure, maybe in the 380s, maybe in the 390s, probably during the reign of Theodosius. This is at the twilight of the Roman Empire. Rome is sacked in 410, so this is just a generation before that. Of course, they don't know that, but Rome's power, especially in the West, is waning. Patrick's Latin name was Patricius. Now think about what that might mean. If you've heard the word patrician, if you say someone is very patrician, you usually today it might be sort of an insult. They're very hoity-toity. They're elitist, but a patrician was someone of the noble class, a patrician class. Patrick's family was part of the land-owning elite in Britain. His grandfather Potitus, that's kind of a nice name. That's why they had all the potatoes. No, there's no connection. His grandfather Potitus was a priest. His father, Calpornius, was a deacon. Just to remind you how the hierarchy of offices worked here, the lowest level of ordained clergy is a deacon. A deacon was an assistant, an intern of sorts to the priest. So the next is a priest, often called a presbyter, and then the bishop. The bishop has the power to ordain other priests. So Potitus was a priest, Calpurnius was a deacon. He was also something called a decurone, which is a civil magistrate in the city. He was a part of the city council. So in other words, he came from a family, all things considered, was part of the aristocracy. To have a grandfather as a priest, to have a father who's a clergy, even a low-level clergy, often and also a low-level magistrate, meant that they had more than most people. They had a family estate, which Patrick says is near the town of Banaventa Bernii. We don't know where that is. Banaventa Bernii is what Patrick calls it. There's many theories where this is, and as you can imagine, lots of towns and regions throughout Britain would like to claim it as the birthplace and the home of Patrick, but no one knows for sure. But our best guess, what would make sense, is that this is somewhere near the western part of Britain, probably the northwest. I should have brought a map of the British Isles. Do I dare to attempt? Is anyone here from Britain? It's got to be Matthew Kirk is supposed to be here. There's oh boy, this is okay. There's Ireland, and then there's sort of there's this over here is Great Britain. That's really that's a lot like VeggieTales, like Bob and Larry. So it gives you some sense. It makes sense that he was probably somewhere up here. The Scots might want to claim him as being in southern Scotland, maybe more likely that he was in northern England. Why here? Because as you'll hear in just a moment, he was taken into slavery as a young man from Irish raiders. So they were coming by sea, and when their boats come, they would have grabbed people there on the coast. So almost certainly he lived somewhere near the coast, probably at a close distance, relatively speaking. This is the Irish Sea, the Atlantic over here, the continent of Europe is over there, somewhere over there in the northwest of England. By the 4th century, Britain had been a part of the Roman Empire for more than 300 years. So the island had been Romanized, at least up to Hadrian's Wall. Some of you maybe in traveling through there have seen that demarcation, the northern boundary, as it were, of the Roman Empire. Romanizing the island had been slow and treacherous, but it had happened over time. As recently as 360, there were attacks from the Picts in the north. Those are eventually become the Scottish. The Saxons in the east, and then the Irish in the west. Interestingly, many ancient writers called Patrick and other of the Irish, they called them the Scotti, which the Scottish ended up being these people over here, but that's what they were called, as sort of a derisive name. Walled towns was where you wanted to be. It's where you could be safe. This is very much still like the ancient world of the Bible. A town is safe if it has a wall. You don't have planes, you don't have tanks, you don't have vehicles. So people come and you want to live somewhere that has a wall. Farms and villages were not safe. These Picts and Irish and Saxons would come in, and sometimes they were driven off, sometimes their raids were successful. Patrick, depending on who you read, either spoke Latin or British. Now, what was British? Scholars say British survived Latin and evolved and eventually became Welsh. So probably spoke British as his first language, but as someone who had the opportunity to be educated, remember, most people would not have been able to read and write, but he was a part of a low-level aristocracy, and so he received an education, where he studied Latin. Though one of the themes in his confession and in his letter is he's often bemoaning the fact that he was very bad at Latin. So any of you who've had that at Covenant Day or in your classical education, and you say, I'm bad at Latin, you could still be St. Patrick. So he was always aware. It's probably some feigned humility, but there was also a sense of reality to it. He always felt like, I didn't get the education that I should have, and we'll learn why in just a moment. He says in his confession, quote, unlike the others, I did not study law and the sacred sciences in an excellent balance. I had very little training and formal education. This can be easily seen from the quality of my writing. Later he says, above all else, I am a simple man and an unlearned refugee. That's what in Ireland, a refugee from Britain. He was very well aware of his relative lack of learning, especially compared to others who had risen to the rank of bishop in the church. Though he grew up in the church and in a Christian family, grandfather's a priest, father's a deacon, he admits he did not really know God until later in life. He says he went through those first years into his teen years not thinking anything about God. He probably would have called himself an atheist or an agnostic, to use our language. Certainly not an atheist. He would have believed in some kind of God, but he wasn't a Christian. He did something, and this is very important, and history is shrouded in mystery at times. He did something when he was a 15-year-old boy that haunted his conscience for the rest of his life. And before he became a priest, we'll come to that later, he had to confess this sin. And at the time, his confessors said, well, I don't think this prevents you from becoming a priest. But 30 years later, as an older man, this sin was revealed. His best friend betrayed him, who knew of this sin and shared it with others. And the bishops in Britain tried to bring him up on charges, wanted to see him removed from the ministry because of this sin when he was 15 years old. What was it? Well, we don't know, except tantalizing bit of information. He says it happened one day in his youth, and then he says, not even in a day, but in a single hour. Immediately, we jump and think, okay, what does a 15-year-old boy do in a single hour? You think perhaps it was some sexual escapade that haunted him the rest of his life, and that could very well be, though, okay, that's wrong, that's sinful, don't do that. It's also not unheard of, and wouldn't have been unheard of then. And so it is a bit hard to think that that one sin might have been so damning to his conscience and to his ministry that people would try to remove him for that sin. It could be, but other scholars speculate, maybe it was some kind of rank idolatry. Maybe he performed some pagan druidical sacrifice, or perhaps even murder. Was he out in the field somewhere and, like Moses, got into a fight and he killed someone? We don't know. Patrick never denied it was a serious sin, and it weighed on his conscience his whole life, and it came back to haunt him. When almost 16 years old, so this happens 15, he's almost 16, so still 15, Patrick is captured by Irish raiders, and he's taken with thousands of others across the Irish Sea to be a slave. I don't know if you can figure out what lights went off, Albert, or though I guess one just burnt out. So these raiders come across the Irish Sea to Britain, and they take Patrick and thousands of others. And they send him off to, just imagine, likely at night, sleeping in your villa. You've known this world that your father has known, your grandfather has known. You're receiving an education. You're 15 years old. In the middle of the night, chaos ensues. These barbarians come in, they pillage your villa, and they take off hundreds or thousands of you into slavery. Patrick lands in Ireland, which, though by our measure is not a great distance, must have seemed to him like a different world. Ireland did not have a good reputation in the ancient world. as we'll see again and again, it was considered the literal ends of the earth. Now, it's a myth that people in the ancient world believed the earth was flat. In the Middle Ages, there are textbooks called Sphere about the globe. There are writers who they did not think the earth was flat. That's a myth. So at the ends of the earth, they didn't really think you fall off. But as far as they knew, the world and the inhabited lands, this was the very edge, a frozen, uninhabitable wasteland filled with vile, monstrous people. Sorry, Irish. One Greek writer in the ancient world said the Irish were cannibals who would eat their dead fathers and have sex with their own mothers and sisters. I'm giving you the PG-13 version. There's even more to these Irish. One Roman author said the Irish enjoyed draining the blood of their enemies and smearing it on their faces. One report would say that part of the pagan ritual for someone to become a king, and don't think a big king, but maybe a clan chieftain, that the king would have to have sex with a horse, would prove his manliness, and then they'd kill the horse and they'd eat him. These were the stories that abounded, whether they were all true or not, about the Irish. St. Jerome, who translated the Vulgate, Jerome reported that he, with his own eyes, saw Irish savages, excuse the PG-13, maybe more, cut the nipples and buttocks off their victims and eat them as a special treat, Jerome said. So these were the Irish. So don't think Lucky Charms. Don't think that little guy in the green at the Notre Dame games. Don't think Rudy. These were they thought of as the Irish. And even if these reports may have been exaggerated and some were hearsay, it is certainly true that Ireland was considered beyond the frontier of civilization. The Romans had never conquered Ireland. So wherever Hadrian's Wall is here, and they Romanized this, but they had never conquered Ireland. So the Irish had been untouched by 400 years of Romanizing rule. And whatever the Romans did wrong, they did give a lot to the places that they conquered. What have the Romans ever done for us? Go watch that. Well, the aqueducts. Well, the aqueducts and the roads. It's an old Monty Python. Don't see the movie, I don't think, but just that little clip. So they had been untouched by 400 years of Romanizing rule. So Patrick must have felt like he had gone into a time warp, stepped back into time when he got off the boat in Ireland. These people were living as people had lived for probably thousands of years. Patrick is enslaved at 15. He is a slave for 6 years, serves a single master, probably doing menial tasks for an ordinary farmer. We know one of his responsibilities was tending sheep, because he mentions that in his confession. He said he would pass the time tending sheep. He would pray hundreds of times a day. He's probably praying the Lord's Prayer, some other kind of rote prayer, memorized prayer. Sometimes he'd pray all through the night. And while enslaved, he became a serious Christian. Could have gone either way. This horror, this trauma of being ripped away from your home at 15, being put into slavery in a strange land, might have made someone embittered to God, but it drew Patrick closer to God. Popular tradition says, that Patrick was, there's my Northern Ireland, and here's Belfast. So some popular tradition says Patrick was here in Antrim County near Belfast, but sorry to say that's probably unlikely, because later when he escaped slavery, he says that he had to travel 200 Roman miles. It would be about 185 by our miles, 185 miles to get to a ship. So the ship he's going to find is over here. And to go 185 miles in Ireland means he had to be somewhere over here. And he writes in one place, the woods of Foclut near the Western Sea beckoned him to Ireland. That's later when he goes back. And so it makes sense that that's probably where he was. He says at one point he had to tend sheep and pray through snow and frost and rain. And this somewhere here would have been, and still is, a cold, rainy place. So likely somewhere here on the western coast in the north of Ireland is where Patrick was enslaved. Some people say near County Mayo. After 6 years as a slave, he hears a voice speaking to him at night, telling him, "You will soon return to your country." Later, there's a voice that tells him, "The ship is ready for you." Now, the ship is ready for you doesn't mean, cool, I'll roll out of bed and go walk to the dock. He's over here. He's got 185 miles to go to any ship that's going to be sailing back to Britain. So maybe through that rugged terrain, by himself, hiding away, there would have been water to drink, would be fine, but trying to find berries or food. He's maybe going 5-10 miles a day, so you do the math. It took him weeks to make his way to the eastern side of Ireland to this ship, which he believes God has told him is waiting for him. Now, when he gets to the port, whatever port it was over there, maybe near Belfast, the captain is angry and sees Patrick and tells him, "You can't come. You're not getting on our ship." So Patrick turns around. He says he was going back to his shelter, which is probably some very makeshift little hut he had for himself. But he's praying, and he's praying, and he's praying. And while he's praying, one of the sailors calls for Patrick and says that, "We'll take a chance on you and come on board the ship." So Patrick does. And then, the history is often a foreign land, and it's strange to us. So here's another strange comment Patrick makes. He says, quote, this is when he gets on the ship, "However, that day I would not," this is all men, these sailors, all men, "However, that day I would not suck their breasts out of fear of God, but I hoped that they would come to faith in Jesus Christ, for they were pagans. Thus I fell in with them, and we set sail at once." So what in the world? I would not suck their breasts. Hey, good on you, Patrick. Seems like a good decision. So we don't know what this is. There's some record that these rituals still do exist even today in other parts of the world, male to male, some kind of bonding ritual, some kind of hazing initiation. Hey, I'm with you. But Patrick understood it to be a pagan practice, and so he refused to do so. They let him on the ship anyways. 3 days later, that's not a long voyage, 3 days later, they land in Britain. For 4 weeks, they make their way through deserted land without food. And then the story, very much Jonah-like, the captain of the ship blames Patrick. "We're in this mess because we let Patrick on board, and where's your God to help us, Patrick?" And so Patrick, with great confidence, says he'll pray, and then he says, "If you would convert and turn to the Lord, I know my God will send food for our journey." And sure enough, a short time later, they come across a herd of pigs, just happened to be walking in the road. And it says that they ate pork for 2 days and recovered their strength. They gave thanks to God. We don't know how much they converted, but they gave thanks to Patrick's God, and Patrick was a hero. We're starving. You call on your God. He gives us 2 days of bacon palooza. Wonderful. Eventually, Patrick makes it back home. Again, can you imagine, just as a parent, as a family, you would have assumed you never going to see your son again, taken off by Irish. Does this ever happen that they after 6 years, and to have a 15-year-old disappear and a 21-year-old grown man come back home? They must have been thrilled to see him. Patrick says his family was overjoyed, and they begged him never to leave again. Wouldn't you? You know, we do that when our kids come home from college for the summer. Never go. But after a while, okay, you can go. He broke his parents' heart because sometime later he has a vision. And in the vision, he hears a man from Ireland. He says the man's name was Victor. The fact that he gives him a name makes you think maybe it was someone he knew in Ireland. Maybe it was a fellow slave. Maybe it was a pagan. Maybe it was his master. Maybe it was someone he converted. But he has a vision of this man Victor, and he says he was carrying thousands of letters. And one letter is read to Patrick, and it starts out saying, "The voice of the Irish." And Patrick says it was as if he could hear the voice of all the people shouting to him, quote, "We implore you, O holy boy." That's what they called him. You're the holy boy. Yeah, they had insults even back then. "We implore you, O holy boy, to come here and be with us." After praying, after more inner promptings, after being tested, he goes to some of the elders of the church. Patrick is convinced that he needs to return to Ireland. He didn't go immediately. We don't know what happened in these intervening years. We don't know how many years it took. But we know that he stayed in Britain long enough to receive some kind of training. They don't have seminaries, they don't have colleges, but some kind of training, because when he lands back in Ireland, by the time he arrives, he's a bishop. So he must have received enough training, been there long enough to be ordained a deacon, be ordained a presbyter, and then to be ordained a bishop. At youngest, he returns to Ireland in his early 30s. He wasn't the first Christian in Ireland. He wasn't even the first bishop. That man, the first bishop, was Palladius. Poor Palladius, the Pope sends him in 431 because there's a few Christians in Ireland and they say, "We want a bishop." And he comes in 431, and by 432, Patrick is the bishop in Ireland. So there's no St. Pally's Day. I don't know. It's St. Patrick. So whatever happened, he's replaced after a year. Patrick lands in 431. Palladius is gone by 432. Now Patrick is the bishop over the church. What did he do? He preached. He planted churches. He ordained priests. By his own account, he says he baptized thousands of converts. And he says, I like this phrase, "And the Lord had mercy on me 1,000,000 times." He encouraged the monastic life, which was at its beginnings. He encouraged lifelong celibacy. As much as he encouraged virginity, likely he was one himself, he said Ireland was filled with idols and unclean things. And it was a land of gods and goddesses, of druids and pagan priests, of sacrifices and sorcery. But by the end of his life, Patrick says they had become a people of God. Later, legend would say every last Irish man and woman had become a Christian. Well, that's surely not true. But there had been a discernible change as Ireland embraced Christianity. As an old man, Patrick had a sizable Christian community under his care. He had some success with kings, some with druids. Most of his success, and this is often the case with church, was with women. They were the ones most receptive to his message. Now, with this success, people are people, came jealousy, came accusation, came opposition. In particular, the bishops back in Britain were not happy. So he wrote, I erased it, he wrote his confession in part to defend himself to the bishops back in Britain who did not like what he was doing. One of their charges against him, kind of contradictory, was that on the one hand they said, "You're lining your pocket with the collections from these rich women and from the people. You're converting them and then they're giving you offerings and you're just getting rich." Patrick says, "Yeah, come look at my life. I'm not rich, and in fact, I've gotten myself in trouble many times because I refuse the gifts that they're giving me." Well, then they were also upset because he was refusing the gifts that he was getting because, just read between the lines, they likely wanted those shipped back to Britain to help support the mother church there. Maybe that was all avarice on their part, or maybe there were genuine needs and they said, "You're not doing your part." It's like, "You're our church planter. give back to the denomination. So they were upset with Patrick. Patrick is mentioned, as I said, in this confession that he's written. And let's just briefly, before we just close with some of his significance, talk about this second. The letter to a man named Coroticus. Sounds like a rough dude. What happened, Patrick tells us in this letter, is on the day after a large group of Christians had been baptized. These would be converts, adults, maybe young people. He says, on the day after they were baptized and confirmed in the church, the soldiers of this captain Coroticus attacked the Christians, quote, Patrick says, while they were still dressed in white and their foreheads were still fragrant with chrism. Some of the group were enslaved, others were slaughtered. Because of their evil deeds, Patrick writes in the letter, I am unable to call them my countrymen or fellow citizens of the Holy Romans, for they are fellow citizens of the demons. Indeed, their evil causes them to live in death together with the pagan Irish and the apostate Picts. The Picts and the Irish. Now that's an interesting phrase when he says, they're as bad as the pagan Irish and the apostate Picts. That means that Coroticus and his soldiers, in some sense, had been included in the church. They weren't just another set of pagan Irish. This is what made this travesty even worse. These were people who had some, maybe they had been baptized themselves, they had some connection to the church in Ireland, and here they go to line their own pockets, to loot and to pillage, to rape and to murder. They enslave these Christians, and they murder the others. Patrick was incensed. And so he writes this letter. Again, you could probably read it in a half hour. It's not long. And he sent it to Coroticus. He sent it to the bishops in Britain. He sent it to Christians throughout Ireland. It was a viral blog post that went to as many people as he could send it to. He begins again by noting he's unlearned, he's unworthy, but he also states now he's a bishop. So he's humble, but he has authority. The letter was partly comfort, trying to comfort his fellow Irishmen who are mourning this great loss of life. It was partly a plea to Coroticus and his soldiers, release the people that you've imprisoned or enslaved. It was partly a summons to Coroticus and his soldiers to repent, and it was partly a prayer for divine justice. And finally, it was partly a warning to the British leaders not to look the other way. This is probably what he was most concerned about. Then, as now, to be a captain of an army, so you want to keep, especially in the ancient world, you want to keep the soldiers on your side. You don't want to make opposition with the people who have the weapons. So he was concerned that the British bishops and others would look the other way, or they'd want to play nice with Coroticus. You don't want to get on his bad side. After all, he did this to these Christians. Who's to say he might not do that to you? Patrick wanted them to have courage and to call out. And though he didn't have exactly the power to excommunicate, this letter served as kind of a public excommunication. He said, don't just look the other way. He said, I want you to shun these people. I don't want you to give them Christian comfort and graces. These people are citizens of hell. Here's what he writes. I do not know for whom I should lament the more, for those who were killed, or for those who were physically enslaved, or for those instead that the devil himself has ensnared so terribly. For all eternity, they will suffer the pains of Gehenna as slaves to the company of the devil. Patrick, I feel bad for the dead. I feel bad for the new. I feel worse for is you, Coroticus, and your men who are slaves to the devil and are going to hell. Patrick died sometime in the second half of the 5th century. In keeping with his wishes, he was buried in an unmarked grave. Doesn't stop people from still making pilgrimages or claiming relics, but wise on his part, be buried in an unmarked grave. By tradition, his resting place is at Downpatrick, south of Belfast, but no one knows for sure. March 17, that date's uncertain, but that's traditionally been given as his death, and so St. Patrick's Day is celebrated on the 17th. Patrick wouldn't have liked the kind of cultists that grew up around him. I don't mean a technical cult, but sort of the legend of Patrick grew. But it does speak to how much he had done to shape Ireland and set them on the path of becoming Christian, that something like a cult of St. Patrick could even emerge. Patrick's work in Ireland led to other enterprising mission endeavors. Columba on Iona, which is, the Scotland, but the Hebrides, founded his community there. So Columba is often thought to have evangelized the Scots. Augustine, not of Hippo, but a different Augustine, to evangelize among the Angles and the Saxons. A man named Willibrord among the lowland and the Frisians. Boniface among the Germans. Eligius among the French. Ansgar in Scandinavia. And on the list goes. So here, let's talk in closing about some of this significance. Patrick's significance lies not only in his example and his remarkable life and what he did in Ireland, but what his life spurred on, what his mission and ministry represented as a missionary enterprise to the ends of the earth. I forgot to bring it in. I've maybe held it up before. It's a big 500-page book by a scholar named Richard Fletcher. It came out in the 90s, I think. It's called, I wrote it down. What's it called? The Barbarian Conversion from Paganism to Christianity. And it's really, it's long, but it's a riveting book because it tells the incredible story. And it would seem incredible not to be believed, except it actually happened. The story of how Christianity spread, and in particular, the Christianization of Europe. How did that happen? Well, as I read that book years ago, I wrote down in one of the pages 3 things that I was distilling from the book on how the Christianization of Europe happened. Thinking like a preacher, even then, I wrote down power, preaching, and persistence. Let me say a word about each of those in the Christianization of Europe. Power. This is the most strange to us. And from our vantage point, we're not always sure what to do about these stories. Did they all happen? Some of them exaggerated. If they did happen, should they have happened? There are all sorts of stories as the gospel spreads throughout Europe of Christians destroying temples, statues, of miraculous healings, of people overcoming conjurers of spirits, of exorcism, blindness being cured, paralysis healed. Sometimes they would burn the pagan temples. They would raze to the ground the shrines. There are stories of people being paralyzed for working on the Sabbath, and that was a testimony to the truth of Christianity. There are stories, lots of stories of people, beginning in around Patrick's time, people warding off evil by making the sign of the cross. Martin of Tours was said to have deflected a tree that was falling by making the sign of the cross. A hermit put to flight 2 dragons in his cave with the sign of a cross. A holy abbot was having a meal with this evil man, and he made the sign of a cross, and the cup shattered and a snake slithered out. Another holy man said he made the sign of a cross, and it sent a whole swarm of wasps back into the ground. That would be helpful. Perhaps here's something, though, we can learn, even if those stories seem strange to us. What the missionaries and the evangelists and the ordinary Christians were trying to show was that Christianity had a better answer to the most besetting problems in life. So when you're an ancient person and you're living hand to mouth and in the wilderness and tilling the soil, your major problem is how do you cope with the forces of nature? We got heat, we got air conditioning, we got cars, Nature still messes us up, but it's an inconvenience. It's not the thing that presses on. Well, that's what presses on them. You have animals, you have bees, you have floods, you have heat, you have cold. So one of the things the stories show, Christianity had more effective power. They came to believe that Christianity could cope with the forces of nature better than the pagan religion. So what might be an analogy for our day? Perhaps it is to show that Christianity has better, more effective power to deal with anxiety, gives a better way to raise a family, sets in place better communities, leads to greater prosperity and freedom. These are the sort of things that perhaps we might need to show in the realm of power. And in preaching, there's evangelism, sermons, inside churches, outside of churches, lots of words, lots of writing. And think about it, we can forget how unique it is that Christianity is an evangelizing religion. Many, perhaps most religions, are not absolutizing in the way that Christianity is. Certainly wasn't the case with the Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses. That was all about two things: addition, not subtraction. It was about addition, and it was about what worked. So you can always add Jesus, that's fine, add another god, add another goddess, add another ritual. It's always adding, and it's what works. Just tell me, does that work? Does it help your wife get pregnant? Does it help the crops to grow? Does it help ward off the enemies? That's what religion was. It looks to us like superstition, but that's what religion was. Christianity, by contrast, says, no, there's one God, and there's heaven and hell, and there's only one way. This is the way. Before the Mandalorian, this is the way. And ironically, just a little aside here, you could argue that one of the reasons the culture wars in this country and in the West are so pronounced, and I'm thinking of fights over, say, people who make environmentalism a kind of religion, or the sexual revolution, or when social justice becomes a kind of religion. One of the reasons, perhaps, for such a conflict is because those new isms still have the kind of Christian impulse that the claims to truth we make are universal, are absolutizing, that this way of seeing the world is the way that the world really is, and everyone ought to see it this way. That's part of the heritage of Christianity. So we're almost always dealing with, in some sense, Christian heresy. Here's the message that Patrick preached. He writes this in his confession, and it gives a sense of the sort of gospel he would have given. Now, obviously, he's writing it down, so it's more exalted language. But here's what he says in one paragraph, quote, "Because there is no other God, nor was there ever any before him, nor will there be any after him. For he is God the Father, unbegotten and ungenerated, who is the source of every beginning, and as we have learned, holds all things in being. We declare that his Son, Jesus Christ, has always been with the Father. Before time began, he was spiritually begotten by the Father in an inexplicable way. Through Christ, all things visible and invisible were made. He was made man. He overcame death. He was received into heaven by the Father, who gave him all sovereignty over every name in heaven and on earth and under the earth, that every tongue should confess his name. For Jesus Christ is Lord and God, in whom we believe and whose coming we await in the near future. He will be judge of the living and the dead, who will reward every man as his deeds deserve, and who will pour out in abundance the Holy Spirit upon us as the gift and pledge of immortality. The Holy Spirit makes believers and those who obey God into children of God and co-heirs of Christ as we confess and adore the one God in Trinity of holy names." Oh, I thought you were unlearned, Patrick. That'll preach. As strange as the ancient world seems to us and these stories of miracles and the rest, that message of the Christian faith still sounds very familiar to us. And explicitly Trinitarian, as we'll see in this morning's sermon from Revelation. Power, preaching, and finally persistence. We need to keep this in mind as we think about how to re-evangelize the West and the rest of the world. It was long, slow, tedious work. Meeting with people, dealing with conflict, navigating cultural landmines, handling church politics. Patrick faced rivals, dissensions, betrayals, opposition, misunderstanding from inside the church and outside the church. Many in Britain didn't like the work he was doing because they did not think the Irish were worth saving. They were savages beyond the reach of civilization. In the book I mentioned, The Barbarian Conversion, chapter 2 is called The Challenge of the Countryside. You may have heard this before. The Latin word paganus means rural, rustic, of the countryside. And there's debate about how paganus is related to our word pagan, but at least one of the theories, and probably the majority theory, is that the people in the countryside were the hardest to make Christian. They were the ones that put up the most and the longest resistance to the gospel. They were the pagans. Pagans were the people in the countryside. Now, we're used to thinking, no, wait. People in the country, that's where the church is. Well, it's true then, and it's true now. Generally speaking, the countryside is always more conservative. And that can be good or it can be bad. So if you're not going along with the madness of our world, then that might be a good thing. But if you're clinging to the pagan gods and goddesses, then being the conservative country people is not a great thing. It was where the slowest change took place. Let us never forget this Christianization took a long time. And yet, by the year 1000, so just a millennium, there were Christian churches from China to Greenland. Here's a list of the spread of the church. First century, Christian communities in Egypt, and I'll just give the countries as we know them today. Egypt, Sudan, France, Italy, Germany, Britain, Iraq, Iran, India, Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Turkey, Albania, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, and Armenia. Round of applause, the Armenians, the first state to officially adopt Christianity in the early 4th century. Second century, spreads to Morocco, Bulgaria, Portugal, Austria. 3rd century, Switzerland, Belgium, Qatar, Bahrain, Hungary, Luxembourg. 4th century, Afghanistan, Ethiopia. 5th century to Liechtenstein, Ireland, Patrick, Central Asia. 6th century to Yemen, Sri Lanka. 7th century to China, the Netherlands, Indonesia, Niger, Mongolia. 8th century to Iceland and Pakistan. By the 9th century to Tibet, Myanmar, Denmark, the Czech Republic, Sweden, Norway. 10th century to Hungary, Russia, Greenland, Bohemia, Poland. The 12th century to Finland. Over the course of 1,000 years, little by little, with great persistence, the church spread and grew. In his confession, Patrick writes movingly about his burden to evangelize the Irish. And he explicitly links his vocation to the commands of Scripture. If you read his confession, it's abounding in Scripture. Lots of allusions and quotations. The nations will come to you from the ends of the earth, he says. I put you like a light among the nations. I shall make you fishers of men. He saw his life through the lens of Matthew 28 and Acts 1. Patrick prayed, quote, that God would never allow me to be separated from his people whom he has won in the end of the earth. And for Patrick, the end of the earth was Ireland. His work was concentrated on the northern part of the island, but he went, he says, to places at the very edge of the world, places that no one had ever seen before. If you've been to Ireland, you know how it's green, and the hills, and its history, and it's beautiful. But it was the land of barbarians. Julius Caesar was the first to call Ireland Hibernia, like hibernate, because he thought it was a barren, frozen wasteland. Now, pleasant surprise, actually wasn't that cold because it was to the west of Britain, and ancient geographers thought it was to the north of Britain. So wet, yes, not freezing cold. But it was the edge. You could imagine if you were on the western coast of Ireland and looking out with this rugged terrain behind you and looking out at a seemingly limitless expanse of ocean that you could conclude, this is it. You don't get farther away than this. This is the end of, certainly for Romans, this was the end in the north and the west of any world that they could imagine. Patrick was soaked in the Bible, but that wasn't unheard of. Here's what was new. Give our close to Richard Fletcher in his book, The Barbarian Conversion. No one within Western Christendom to this point had been possessed by this missionary impulse. Here's how Richard Fletcher puts it, quote, "As far as our evidence goes, Patrick was the first person in Christian history to take the scriptural injunctions literally, to grasp the teaching that all nations meant teaching even barbarians who lived beyond the border of the frontiers of the Roman Empire." Certainly not the first person to bear witness. That's all through the New Testament in the church. Not the first person to plant churches where there hadn't been churches. Paul did that. But perhaps the first person, at least in the West, we might call a self-conscious missionary, and not just a missionary, but to the unwashed, to the barbarian hordes. This is Patrick's legacy, a pious and zealous desire to see the Great Commission fulfilled, even, or perhaps especially, to the Irish, who were the very people who enslaved him. Maybe 2 minutes. If you have a question or a comment, then I'll let you go. Yes?
That is quick.
Yeah.
Priests got married and had children back then?
Yeah, very good point. They did. It was not canon law yet that priests could not marry and have children. So you could still do so. The monastic life encouraged virginity and celibacy, but priests could marry and have children. Otherwise, how do we have Patrick? That's right. All right. We will start. We'll kind of gather 9-ish, and I'll start promptly at 9:15, try to end by 10:15, so you can go and get your kids and get to worship. Blessings. See you next week.